sending back reports of locals exhuming and destroying the bodies of the dead who they alleged were attacking them following their deaths. This was alarming to the local Austrian authorities. With these regions now open to the west, such strange accounts of the living dead were translated from official military reports to medical journals, and then they were published as sensational articles in circulation among the fashionable French journals of the Salon, and everybody at that salon was talking about vampires by the mid-18th century. An early such military account is the 1725 case of Peter Plojogowicz. Well, Peter dies, as is pre-vampire custom, only to appear again to various family members by night, strangling them and drinking their blood. And within a week, 9 people had died, all apparently suffering from a brief 24-hour illness following the vampiric attack by Peter. The local population implored the new imperial provisor to exhume the body and to look for telltale signs of vampirism. This was not their first rodeo, a custom that we're told actually went all the way back to the period of the Ottoman administration of the region. It appeared that the Ottomans, they were fine with people hunting vampires. Despite some protests, digging people up and cutting their head off and driving stakes through their hearts, it was a common motif in these vampire stories, the sort of the idea of the rational person giving in to the superstitious barbaric crowds. And sure enough, they dug the body up and it was found to be undecomposed, with skin, hair, and nails grown freshly along with blood, liquid blood, fresh blood in his mouth. Satisfied that Peter had become a vampire and was responsible for all these deaths, the villagers, they drove a stake through his heart and fresh blood gushed out of his body. There's even an oblique reference in the story that his corpse had an erection, which is also sometimes part of what happens when you're decomposing. Again, pointing to the rapacious element of vampirism, the idea of this death erection really troubled people. The body was staked, it was then burned, and the official reports make sure to deny any personal responsibility on behalf of the provisor. He doesn't want any part in this nonsense, but he does ask to please inform him if he's made any mistakes in the matter. It's a lovely bureaucratic flourish to cap off a rather extraordinary tale, frankly. While the attacks again here remain spectral in this account, Peter never seems to come out of his grave to attack people, all the other principal elements of vampirism are certainly present, and this tale might be one of the first recognizably modern vampire accounts. However, it wouldn't become the most notable. That honor is going to be given to Arnold and Paul, first published in 1732. Again, emerging from the world of the military bureaucracy, along with a strong adjunct of the medical gaze, looking at you, Foucault, the original German reads as oddly matter-of-fact, considering what are ostensibly the facts of the case. The text, now known as Visum et Repertum, seen and discovered, as indicated by the affidavit-like conclusion, opens with the soon-to-become vampire already knowing his fate, strangely. He's already been infected with vampirism. Fearing himself infected, as I mentioned, Arnaud actually has attempts to solve this. He consumes earth from another vampire's grave. He smears himself in vampiric blood in an attempt to end his vexations. However, he falls off a hay wagon, he breaks his neck. The former soldier is then buried, and he's doomed to join the restless dead. Immediately following his burial, Paul would go on to directly kill 4 people. But because he had also predated upon livestock to drink their blood, he had infected numerous other people with vampirism indirectly. They ate some of the flesh of those animals. In all, more than 20 people would directly or indirectly die from his alleged vampiric rampage before, after 40 days following his burial, he was exhumed. Again, undecayed, covered in fresh blood, with new skin and nails, the vampire was staked through the heart, causing him to audibly groan and bleed copiously before his remains were cremated. That detail of him groaning is not actually attested to by the people that were there. They weren't there for several years later, but it's made it into the literature. Of course, with vampirism being pestilential, 13 other people would also be exhumed and inspected by medical professionals, of which many people were found to be vampires and were similarly dealt with, from children to the elderly. They went through coffin by coffin looking for vampires. However, others would be normally decomposed, while, like I said, others, like the 60-year-old Melisa, who were found in life to be thin. She was thin in her life, was now found to be plumply engorged with blood. Though forensic analysis of the dead said that she was patient zero of the second wave of the infection, having been the first to have eaten of the sheep infected by Paul. This document is, aside from the tale told, also made all the more credible by the people that read it and the signatures attached to it. No less than 5 military and medical officers attest to the truth of all these events, though many of them had actually happened many years prior to their arrival, so there's that. Regardless, the affidavit-like bureaucratic nature of the document had the power to attest to the veracity of all of these events, thus cementing this account in the veracity of the vampire legend. Again, with nearly all of the elements of the lore functioning in this text for the first time, with a special emphasis on the epidemiological, the medical nature of vampirism, and the change of the appearance of the undead, with the ruddish complexion of the undead, the vampire, as opposed to the typical pallor of the entombed. What's rather outstanding about these earliest accounts of vampire lore is just how different they are when compared to later 19th century narratives, much less contemporary narratives with their damn sparkling. Rather than well-dressed, handsome aristocrats, we have peasants. Most attacks are formed through spectral, mystical bodies, rather than physically resurrecting and walking around. Throttling, strangulation is just as common, if not more common, than blood drinking as the means of violence committed by the vampires. And they're absent in much of the way of things like shape-shifting, turning into a bat or a wolf or fog or any other supernatural powers. We don't see them much in that way here. And rather than the lean, pale vampire we have like Nosferatu, they're plump, zaftig, and they're ruddish, red with gore. Which is consumed at a distance through some weird occult means, which is somehow even stranger than drinking blood from your neck or your chest for that matter. Of course, very many other vampire elements are perfectly here in the lore, especially the post-mortem diagnosis of vampirism, the re-killing through staking and cremation, and the epidemiological character of vampirism as a kind of disease. Further, the accounts are already themselves knocking at the door of theological polemics, as if the vampires were inverse Christs. The consumption of blood, the eating of bread made from vampire blood or graven earth, the 40 days that Paul was in the earth, the resurrection of the vampire after their death, the seeming prolonged afterlife, maybe eternal life given to them, much of which was gained through a relatively sinful life, or at least a sinful departure, like suicide, for instance, from this world, and even the mockery of the incorruption of the saints, in Catholic tradition at least, as these creatures gorged themselves with blood in their graves. It wasn't only monstrous, many such monsters and specters abounded, but it was the very concept of the vampire as a theological and philosophically abhorrent matter, that such creatures could exist at all, an outrage against especially Catholic Christianity and the naturalism of the Enlightenment. I mean, these creatures are miraculous. That shouldn't be happening in the naturalism theories either. The vampire wasn't only an attack on the peasants of Eastern Europe at the edges of what was Europe at that time. It was also an attack at the very jugular of 18th century Catholicism and rational naturalism. So both Catholics and naturalists had to become vampire hunters. As I mentioned a bit ago, as early as Romft and others, the central problem was the degree to which those that chewed in their tombs, and eventually the existence of vampires properly, was a theological problem for the Catholics. The central issue was to what degree were they alive in their tombs and out prowling about. Central to that issue was both the seeming resurrection from the dead, as I mentioned, but also their existence as a kind of mockery of Catholic theology. Vampires, they were somehow antichrists, anti-priests, and anti-saints all at once. So that wasn't going to stand. Though I should mention for the Orthodox, the old incorruptibility thing was fine. Excommunicated people, according to their theology, didn't decay. Further, 18th century Catholicism was undergoing a rather radical shift to naturalism, increasingly embracing elements of positivism, especially in the evaluation of miracles. Even one of the great miracle debunkers would eventually become Pope. Thus, the seeming novel existence of vampires was an undeniable test case for this rather modern theological stance. Could Catholic theology weather the problem of vampires? While conclusions